Welcome to the CanMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. I am your host, Ben Amaralt. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Medicinal Genomics and proud member of the team that puts on the CanMed Summit. All right, the CanMed 25 abstract submission portal is now open and will be until November 15th. So, if you have done any novel research in the areas of cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, or safety testing, we want to hear from you. If your abstract is accepted by our advisory board, you will receive a 50% discount on the CanMed 25 full summit package, which includes 3 nights at the Wyndham Grand Rainforest Beach and Resort with all the associated amenities, full access to the CanMed Medical Practicum, industry workshops, oral and poster presentations, and networking events, and all-inclusive meals, which include a welcome reception, lunches, and themed beach dinners. Not only will you get to present your work on the stage at CanMed 25, but a video recording of your presentation will be added to the CanMed archive and the Medicinal Genomics YouTube page for additional exposure after the event. And let me tell you, more than one of our CanMed videos have reached up to 6 figures in views. Use the link in the show description to submit your abstract today, or go to canmedevents.com and click the button. Our guest today is Liz Thompson. With a bachelor's in molecular biology and a master's in physiology, Liz has studied the human body through many lenses. The focus of her PhD program in pharmacy is to explore disorders that have directly impacted her life in the world of professional contact sports and how cannabinoid products could potentially play a role in them. As a member of the clinical trial team that was recently awarded funding from the NFL to study cannabinoids in concussion and pain, she is excited to bring new data to the literature exploring cannabinoids in athletics. Liz and her team recently published an extensive literature review titled Cannabinoid Therapy in Athletics, a review of current cannabis research to evaluate potential real-world cannabinoid applications in sport, which establishes a foundation for their future research. During our conversation, we discussed how Liz became interested in the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids, the published literature that supports using cannabinoids for neuroinflammation in neurodegenerative disorders, her team's collaboration with the NFL in ongoing clinical trials focused on neuroinflammation and recovery in athletes, particularly after concussions, the current use of cannabis in athletics and how sports organizations are changing their policies, future directions of research, and more. Before we get to my conversation with Liz, I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, the Dent Institute. With more than 300,000 patient visits per year, the Dent Neurologic Institute ranks among the largest neuroscience centers in North America. Its 24 subspecialty clinics often treat the most challenging neurologic conditions, including, but not limited to, migraine, chronic pain, ALS, MS, Parkinson's, dementia, neuro-oncology, and more. With their mission of advancing neuroscience, they established a cannabis clinic in 2016 to aid in the treatment of these chronic conditions seen throughout their institute. For more information, visit dentinstitute.com. Okay, without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Liz Thompson. Good afternoon, Liz. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of your podcast, so I'm honored to be here.
Oh, well, that's great. Thanks. Well, I'm excited to talk with you today about the work that you and your team are doing to better understand the therapeutic potential of cannabinoids in athletics. So I think a good place to start is, why don't you tell us how you got involved in researching cannabinoids in athletics?
Yeah, for sure. So it was not a linear path, as I don't think anybody's ever really is. But my undergraduate degree is in molecular biology, and then I have a master's degree in applied physiology. And I was always athletic, and so with my physiology degree, we were always looking at training principles or just basically principles of physiology of how can you really push the human body to do things that you want it to do essentially using non-pharmacological agents. So looking at, training principles or nutrition or even supplementation, whatever. So I worked with athletes and I also worked clinically. So I had a patient population. But the biggest driving factor behind it was my husband's actually was an athlete, a professional athlete. And we've been together since we were 17 years old, and I would watch him play and I was like, man, this is not going to end well if you keep
Mhm.
on the head contact and the contact and the contact. And so just knowing, having a background really of molecular mechanisms and understanding what was happening all the time, I started to really look for ways to reduce the neuroinflammation, just thinking like, I don't want to be feeding you with a straw when we're 80 years old. So let's see what we can do. There's got to be things. And there are a lot of things you can do, which is the empowering part about understanding physiology is there's a ton that you can do to really help support your system to reduce those things. And so
Mm.
um, I started looking specifically. So when he was playing, really was in the 2000s. So I'll date myself here, but it was really the height of the opioid epidemics in athletics. Like there was a lot of exposure of opioids, and we had teammates that ended up with opioid problems. We buried some teammates, and I was like, there has to be something better than this. And so in order to understand that, I wanted to understand the mechanisms of how opioids worked. And so I started to look at the molecular mechanisms in the brain of how opioids were actually working and physiologically, like why are people, how does it kill you? What is happening here? And so I came across research that suggested that using cannabinoids, you could actually reduce the required amount of opioids to have the same pain efficacy. And I was thinking, like, that's crazy. How would that even work? And I didn't really know anything about cannabis at all. I mean, I was a downhill ski racer and I played rugby. I was always like, an endorphin junkie. And so we understood cannabis from like a recreational cultural standpoint. I grew up in Canada, it's always around, but I didn't really understand anything about the molecular mechanisms, which was shocking because I'd already finished 2 degrees that were focusing on molecular mechanisms. And I had never seen anything about the endocannabinoid system. So, anyways, I started looking at that and I kind of went down a rabbit hole, and I have been there for probably the last 10 or 15 years, just looking at the different ways that the endocannabinoid system can work. Really in neuroinflammation, but it really goes everywhere throughout your whole body. And so it was looking at things like that. And so then I applied to, I thought, okay, well, I think that I saw the mechanism that I really wanted to look at, and it was the calcium channel. So just getting like super nerdy here, but it was the calcium channels in the neurons. And I thought, well, like who's looking at this? And so I looked for any supervisor anywhere that was actually studying that. And of course, after having a couple people tell you you're totally crazy because it's like, hey, have you ever looked at using cannabis to reduce neuroinflammation? And most people are like, yeah, okay, next. I don't know what you're talking about. But my supervisor now, he he was one of the first people. He was like the only paper that I actually found at that time that was published specifically talking about some of the cytokines and chemokines that happen, when you have neuroinflammation and the potential for maybe some things that cannabinoids could do to reduce those. And so I contacted him. And he knew exactly what I was talking about. And so I was like so thrilled. And so I thought I was going to have to beg him to take me on as a graduate student, but he said, oh yeah, like I would love to have you. And so I applied. And so I wanted to look at concussion specifically with concussion and neuroinflammation in the brain. And, he was happy to do that. And right after that, we saw the call from the NFL. I was actually outside watering my first cannabis plant that I ever grew, and it was in 2021, and it came across my phone, and I was like, Patrick, check it out, like the NFL is actually putting up money to study the thing that I just said, like I that's what we want to look at. And so I didn't really think we would apply. I thought that he'd be like, hey, cool, like we're not crazy, we're this
Mhm.
is not some, people think that yes, someone else thinks this. And so he was, but instead he was like, okay, yeah, we're gonna apply. And so he went and he gathered, and he's wonderful. So he gathered people that he had worked with over the course of his career to look at, like, we're looking at so many different metrics, but we had to put in for, it was an NIH adjudication to go through, all the different researchers that applied for the funding. And we were selected as the group that the NFL would fund to look at all the different metrics for using cannabinoids for neuroinflammation, concussion, pain, and then opioid sparing. So he's my one supervisor that took me on, and then I'm actually double supervised. My other supervisor is the dean of pharmacy. So my PhD is in pharmacy at the University of Saskatchewan. So those two are my supervisors. And we have a team, an amazing team of people that are looking at so many different metrics of, how we can use cannabinoids to potentially reduce some of the things, So for me, it's very personal. I have people in my life, like we are surrounded by athletes. I grew up in sports, and you can only change so many rules and redesign a helmet and a mouth guard so many ways. But unless you're actually focusing on the molecular things inside the skull, you're missing a massive opportunity to do something that I believe, we need the data, and that's why we're getting it to prove that what we believe to be true is actually happening in humans. And we have a ton of preclinical, there's a ton of animal models that show it, but because of the laws and the the prohibition and the inability for researchers to put this substance in a human and actually draw data, which in Canada now is even doubly ridiculous because people can walk down the street and buy it anywhere they want. And it's still actually very hard to do research in Canada, even though at the federal level, it's legal. We've been legal there since 2018. And so it's accessible to anybody in our country that's over the legal age. But to do research was actually still very difficult. And that's why it's taken us so long. That was in 2021. And we just finished the first portion of the clinical trial. So I feel like there'd be a lot more human data if the policies would have allowed researchers to do the research that they've been trying to do for a really long time.
Yeah. No, I guess I didn't realize that Canada had those restrictions on research. I mean, here in the States, we're familiar with it because cannabis, it's a Schedule I drug, and that has a lot of limitations. And now there's talk about rescheduling. We'd prefer descheduling, but I think we'll take rescheduling just because it will open up some of that research. But I didn't realize that Canada had the same issues.
Well, you'd think that it would be easier than it really was. And that was, our ability to do the clinical trial at all, we're definitely at an advantage in Canada. Like the fact that we were able to, we have the cannabis research licenses in our labs, like we're actually able to do it. But it's, the requirements, and it's really probably no different than any other like natural product research,
Sure.
It's just your ability to source the things that you want to source, because you still have to have the stability tests, the investigation brochures. And so like you have to find people that actually have that quality and that grade of the cannabinoids that you want to use, because in order to do a clinical trial, you have to be sure that any of the effects that you're seeing aren't coming from some other reagent or something else that's in the product, right? So it's the same as other things. It's just that the accessibility to the product that you need in order to do it. And then that was very restrictive too, because in order to go through to get a no objection letter, you have to have that on every single molecule that you want to study. And so in cannabis, because it has 500 bioactive molecules, you would need 500 different brochures and investigatives and talks on everything. And so it really kind of handcuffs you to what you can actually do and progress with, because so we had to start with a CBD isolate, because in order to do anything more than that, which, most of us, of course, would want to do something more full spectrum, or, there's reasons, of course, it makes sense to do a clinical trial with just the one, so you can see what is changing in association with just that one molecule. But if you were looking for better outcomes, you could design it better, I think. But
yeah, no, that's tricky. Like you said, so many different compounds in the cannabis plant. Probably even many that we haven't even identified yet.
yeah.
So that makes things tricky.
Right. And that's the thing, is you can't do a clinical trial if you can't identify exactly the mechanisms of what it is you're studying. And so if you're studying, but I think that that's where there's a real place for real world research. And like, because really at the end of the day, what is the point of this research if it's not at least in parallel or mirroring what people are accessing in real life, right?
Sure.
I mean, there are some CBD products, of course, that are isolates, but if you were going to preferentially pick a product, it likely wouldn't be an isolate. If you know how cannabinoid pharmacology works, you would try to design something better, but it's just for the sake of a clinical trial. So of course, some people are like, well, why are you using an isolate? Well, of course, it's not by choice. It's because we had to, and then you progress from there. So in the next couple of steps, we'll be able to hopefully add in some more cannabinoids. But first, there is no data right now at all, even on the CBD isolate. Like that doesn't even exist in a healthy population yet. So what we're doing by putting it into a healthy population is still the first time it's ever been done. We have the metrics on Epidiolex, which is a CBD, but that's not a healthy athletic population. That's in a population of epileptic children. And so I think one thing in cannabis research where people really need to be careful is to identify the population that whatever you're looking at was actually studied in, because you can't take metrics from an epileptic child population and think that that equates to a healthy athletic male population. Those two aren't the same, right? As in same as an epileptic brain, it's not the same as a non-epileptic brain, and that's not the same. So I mean, we have to be really careful at what are we looking at when we're looking at these studies and the studies that do exist. And so in athletics, I think that makes it really complicated, because we do have research that exists in certain things. Humans, not so much. There's lots of preclinical data, lots of animal data, but we have to be really careful in the interpretation of, and that was one of the points in the recent publication that I put out in Sports Medicine, was we have to be careful with our interpretation of research that does exist, and not to take that research and apply it to populations that it wasn't actually done on.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. Now, I wanted to kind of just circle back to the NFL, because I know that's an important part of your research, and kind of getting that approval from them. And it was funny because I was looking back, and so our first event, first CanMed event in 2016, was at Harvard Medical School, and Kyle Turley, former NFL player, actually attended and spoke there, and a documentary film crew followed him for Vice. And so I was going back, and I was watching some of that, and there are clips of the NFL commissioner talking about, cannabis in the NFL and their policy around that. And his stance then was there's not enough evidence to support changing anything at that point. So that's 2016. 8 years later, here we are.
Right.
And I guess it's better late than never. But
Yeah.
speak to kind of how attitudes from the major sports organizations have changed when it comes to cannabis. And do you have any thoughts of kind of what was the tipping point?
Yeah, I do have, I got a lot of thoughts on a lot of things, but yeah, so that, by them saying that we don't have enough evidence to change our policies, that is true. And they stuck with that, the NFL did. And it was actually the players that were pressuring them, saying, okay, fine, like you keep saying you don't have the data. Get the data then. Like figure out how to get the data, because you can't just keep saying you don't have the data. That's kind of, sometimes people will say that as it's like an excuse to just keep bad policies in place.
Right.
It's the same as people saying there's no research. There's tons of research. We have tons of research that is already in the published literature. If you just look like that, it's excuses or these talking points, right? To just kind of leave things status quo, because it is a very disruptive space, because it's very misunderstood, because we have that commercial industry too, right? A recreational industry. But the NFL, it was the players that kind of pressured them. And again, why are we so many years later and we don't have the data? And that is true. And I think one of the most complicated things with cannabis and getting that data is the funding, because really clinical trials are expensive. And so the people that are going to fund clinical trials would be the people that ultimately somehow would have some benefit from seeing the results, right? One way or the other. Now, the NFL truly does want the data. What they do with it is up to them. We are just here to get the data. And it'll be really interesting to see what they do with the data, because, you still have other people that are, well, we need more data. We need more data. So it's hard to say. But I think that ultimately right now, because of the shift in the laws of our countries, the society is shifting. And so the policies that they have in pro sports, and even, I mean, the NCAA just removed cannabis from their prohibited list, because those policies no longer align with society. Like society is changing their laws. And so in order to have fluidity amongst the game and the place of the game in society, the dysfunction, it was starting to become too much. And so I think that was one of the reasons why they were, they got interested in, okay, well, let's see, maybe we can put up some funding and find people to get the data then. Because, you know, it's the amount of money, and yeah, and there's a lot of drug design for sure being done with cannabinoid molecules because the scaffolding of how they work will, it will, I mean, we have data already to show in animal models that there is a ton of effect there in neuroinflammation, neurodegeneration. We know that they are active there. Those molecules are active there. We know that. We now drug design has some complicated things like bioavailability. You have to have reproducible dose. You have to have and then the cannabinoid system itself is very complicated, and so that's a whole different thing. But when you look at funding the clinical trial, it's who would put money into that, because with a product that's available to everybody right now with no prescription needed, and it will continue to be like that, industry is not going away. So whose benefit is it to put the money up to do the research? And even in the commercial industry, they don't actually need any data whatsoever to shelf a product. They don't need to show pharmacokinetic data. They don't need to show bioavailability. They don't need to show anything. They can package a product and sell it as long as they're following the food and drug compliance, but it's not an FDA approved thing. So like there's no incentive for them to fund it because they actually don't need it. They can make an edible product and just put it on the shelf. And so it's tricky to find anybody that it would be interested in doing it. So I think the NFL, like, I applaud them really for doing it because it shows that their minds are at least progressive, and they're not, for a long time, the conversation about cannabis as a medicine just had the brakes on. Like nobody wanted to talk about it or try to understand it, and it's no different than any pharmacological agent. It is bioactive and it should be treated that way. It's just that in society, we've chosen to make it available to everybody. And that's a different conversation, but it is a plant and perhaps should never have been prohibited in the first place. Right. So why we are in this place right now is a different conversation, but it's like, how do we get out of it? And so I applaud the NFL for wanting to actually see the data and putting up, the call for research, because it is not an easy space to get funding for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we get out of it? So it seems like at least the first step is the publication that you mentioned earlier. And the title is Cannabinoid Therapy in Athletics, a review of current cannabis research to evaluate potential real-world cannabinoid applications in sport. So I've looked through the paper, and there's a lot in there about a lot of different uses for cannabinoids in athletics. So I guess in your opinion or in your research, what are some of the most common or most promising applications of cannabinoids in athletics?
Well, for me personally, like where I think they can make the best difference or the biggest difference for me for sure is in neuroinflammation. Like I think right now, and I might be biased because that's what drew me to be interested in it in the first place, but I think right now, I mean, there's a difference, I guess, for where I think it should go and where it is being used as athletes. Those are different things. Like athletes currently, right now, in my experience, another part, I'm gathering data to research athletes themselves, like by talking to them and interviewing them, and also their medical training staff. And so I have some publications coming out on that. But athletes themselves are using it for primarily pain, inflammation, sleep, and somewhat anxiety, mental health things. Now, where do I think for sure those places will be beneficial, but the one place where I think it could be very applicable is in neuroinflammation in the brain and concussion. And there's a few reasons for that. Molecularly, it makes a ton of sense why we could actually use these molecules to invoke the same downstream effects as we would have by our naturally secreted endocannabinoids. But secondly, we don't currently have any pharmacological agent that does anything for concussion or TBI. It is a space where we're just sitting there like there isn't anything that anybody can do to help somebody right now other than, physical therapy, occupational therapy, those types of things like vestibular training, balance and those things. But as far as a pharmacological agent goes, there isn't one. And so for me, it's like, why wouldn't you want to investigate this when it could? And we know statistically, like, contact sport athletes, they die from neurodegenerative disorders at a 3 times greater rate than the population that doesn't play contact sports. So we know that there's something happening there with neurodegeneration and contact sport. The mechanisms of that, of course, biology is a network, it's never linear. So there's a lot of things going on there, but we know from the statistics when you look at the neurodegeneration that absolutely they have a higher rate of it. So for me, to focus on something like that, which is your brain, it
Mm.
just makes a lot of sense because if you could, and so the metrics that we're looking at in our clinical trial, we are looking at, cerebral vascular changes in your brain. Like how does the blood flow actually change in your brain using cannabinoids? We're looking at the oxygenation concentration. So how does the oxygen concentration change in your brain when you're using cannabinoids? Because it comes down to really the question of if you can reduce that neural inflammation, you can reduce the secondary effects of that cascade and domino effect that ultimately leads to neurodegenerative disorders, which is starting at, the secondary effects of what happens when you smash your head together or,
Mm.
whatever. And then I do think also there's some things with the peripheral inflammation also, I believe plays a role in it because you have so many circulating pro-inflammatory signaling molecules that everything, and really that's what inflammation is, right? Inflammation is, everybody thinks of it as a thing. It's not a thing, it's a process.
Right.
Inflammation is a process of signaling molecules that are calling in your immune system to signal them to either, come in, we have a problem, we got to fix this, now we got to clean it up, now we have to reduce, now we have to shut off, and now we're back to homeostasis. That's when inflammation is working correctly. And it should work correctly. Your body is designed to do that. Inflammation only really is a problem when it doesn't shut itself off or when it's chronic. And that's what happens, I think, in the brain. If you can't shut off that inflammation in your brain and it continues to be inflamed, then you end up with neurodegenerative disorders a long time down the road. So if we had the opportunity to use these molecules as pharmacological agents to get in there and reduce that neuroinflammation at that time, I think it would be such an advantage to athletes particularly, but also military. And then also it just ripples out into like the aging population and then all of these neurodegenerative disorders because it's all stemming from the same thing, right? Like there's a setup in your brain and all these cascading things, they're just different flavors of the same candy kind of, right? Like it's all on the same mechanisms. It's just different portions are being broken, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, let's dig into that a little bit. So how, I mean, how ideally would cannabinoids be used for neuroprotection? Is it sort of like a preventative thing that would be taken for anyone who's kind of participating in these types of sports? Or is it sort of, okay, I've had a head injury. Now I need to take cannabinoids to, like you said, cool that inflammation. How does that work?
Yeah, so that is the $1 million question, and there has been research done to look at that, and really the short answer is both. I
Hmm.
mean, so when you look at neuroinflammation in the brain, you have to first look at your endocannabinoid system, which is why and how cannabinoids work in your body at all. So your endocannabinoid system is when you get conked in the head, you secrete endocannabinoids yourself. Like plant aside, this isn't even talking about cannabis, but like you secrete endocannabinoids. And so when there is an injury, a neural injury, your body will secrete those endocannabinoids to go and hit receptors to essentially break the circuit of inflammation and calm it down. And so in concussion, if you at the time of an acute injury, one approach would be okay, well, you could take cannabinoids right there. And there are some places, like I think the Israeli military, I read, uses it on impact. If they get injured, they actually have a nasal spray of a
Hmm.
THC CBD that they nasally inhale because
Oh,
at that time you can hit the CB1 receptor, which essentially shuts those calcium channels and it'll reduce the amount of excitatory neurotransmitter, which is glutamate. If you hit that CB1 receptor, you can actually reduce that out of control secretion that we know happens in concussion. So if you take THC, which is stereochemically basically identical to anandamide, which is what you secrete yourself, if you can't provide enough anandamide yourself, like you can't keep up with the amount of excitatory neurotoxin that's being fired by your neuron, if you can't put out the fire yourself.
Mm,
You can bring in an exogenous molecule such as THC to hit that same receptor, and it would actually cause the same downstream results for all intents and purposes. And it itself will reduce that firing of the excitatory neurotransmitter. So that would be on impact. But CBD does something completely different. And it's very promiscuous. And you have to remember that every molecule in cannabis functions differently than the next. Like they don't all hit the same receptors, which is why it's so fascinating to study. But also, we could be here for another 300 years, like studying it to figure
right.
out what's doing what. But there's certain approaches of thinking of taking CBD, prophylactically to maintain, because CBD does some things basically for your own endocannabinoid system where it helps you maintain um, healthy and hearty endocannabinoid system where it would help support your ability to secrete and use your own anandamide and 2AG. So
Mm,
there's a lot of receptors. I won't go into all of them, but one of the big ones really CBD does is it inhibits the FA enzyme, which is the enzyme that breaks down your own anandamide, which is the thing that hits that CB1 receptor. So there are some thoughts that taking CBD prophylactically, on a consistent basis will allow your own endocannabinoid system to have what it needs to make those endocannabinoids at the time that the injury is going to happen. And in
mm,
sports, you can pretty much bank on the fact that you're going to get
right.
slammed. Like in contact sports, the hit's coming. It's not an if, it's when. And it's, small hits, big hits, whatever, to your body, to your brain. You know that those pro-inflammatory cytokines are going to start firing, and the reactive oxygen species, that that's coming. And so the approach should be to do everything that you can to give your body the ability to reduce it when it does happen. And
Mm,
so using cannabinoids, and also you have to remember in sports too, THC is cognitively impairing. And so you have to
yeah.
be careful with how things affect your decision making or your reaction time or things like that, right? Whereas CBD is not cognitively impairing. And so you can take it and it wouldn't affect your output as an athlete. So there's two schools of thought there. But personally, for me, I think, and again, that's why a lot of the research that does exist, you have to be very careful because the devil's in the details. Like there are some studies that were looking at CBD and how effective CBD was at reducing inflammation, but they only looked at it for 3 hours post inflammation. So I think they were doing a workout protocol, I think. And so they looked at it and it didn't do much. Well, in my opinion, I think the prophylactic approach is going to be better because I
Mm,
think if you're taking it leading up to whatever you're doing, and that has been shown in the research that yes, having it on board before does seem to help when the impact does happen or the inflammation does happen. But CBD seems to work better when there is inflammation in play already. So if your cells aren't already in the process of inflammation, CBD is, it doesn't really have a lot of activity. But for inflammation, I mean. But when things are inflaming, you upregulate a lot of your endocannabinoid receptors, which means the concentration of available receptors to hit has increased. So
mm,
now CBD has something to work on, right? So it's again, you have to look really at what was the population and what was going on at what we were studying or what was that research done on, and then and then you can't really apply what was found in that to a different situation. So for me, I think for athletes taking it, I think take it before. And then if you did have a head contact, then there would be a place for sure to take it immediately after. That's only in my opinion. That hasn't been proven out anywhere because
right.
we can't, we haven't done it in humans yet. But we do have animal models. We have mice models, looking at what happens in their brain when we conk them in the head. And they have a massive secretion of 2AG and anandamide, which are your natural endocannabinoids, and they also have a big upregulation in the CB2 receptors, which are the receptors that are on the microglia, which are the immune cells in your brain. And so in that experiment with the mice, if you gave them an exogenous source of 2AG, the inflammation reduced quickly and you could save the neurons and you could save the tissue and it recovered. And so in theory, mice aren't humans, but in theory, that would be what you would be looking at. Now, again, to make it pharma grade, you'd have to have, a pharma grade product to do that. But in my opinion, we have a product that does it right now. We know the cannabis plant can do it in some degree. So it's just like we don't have anything. So why, if you
Yeah.
know you have something that might have a benefit, why wouldn't you try it rather than sit there and do nothing and let the inflammation just cascade out of control? Because if you do it correctly, we know that CBD has a really high safety profile. It's very safe. CBD is, as long as it's made in the right way. Because these days you have to be careful where you're sourcing it. But if you get good quality CBD, we know that it's safe. So I just think, why wouldn't you try it?
Right. No, and I mean it's a common refrain when we talk about sort of cannabis as a medicine is there's a lot of upside and not a whole lot of downside.
Yeah,
So why not try?
yeah,
And so you mentioned that, perhaps the Israeli military is sort of using a nasal spray um, for treating head injury. To your knowledge, are any sports teams or athletics, do they use CBD? Do they kind of have it as a protocol? Are they experimenting with it?
no. Well, well, again, loaded question. So protocol, no. And so really when it comes down to experimenting with it, yeah, athletes,
Hmm.
yes, because I think that athletes themselves do anecdotally or from each other, they have heard and they have learned, but that's a separate thing from then looking at league and league policies. And
Sure.
so a lot of leagues, even in Canada, like, I mean, in 2018, cannabis became federally legal. So now, okay, if you're an adult, you can use it the same way you use beer. Like, this is not an illegal substance. And so in U Sport, which is the equivalent of the NCAA, in 2020, it was actually stated that like we will no longer test athletes for cannabis anymore. It's not a thing, right? But then the progress isn't made to then, all right, now are you going to develop protocols? Are you going to teach your medical training staff how to use this or how to inform the athletes how to use it properly? And that's the portion of my PhD that I'm working on right now, is really informing the medical staff. Because so what I was gathering was data to see like how much do they even know about
Mm.
cannabis, or what do they think about cannabis, right? And so in Canada, we had an opportunity because we made it legal over 5 years ago to really create teaching opportunities for medical professionals. And this isn't even just for athletics, it's for all medical professionals. There is still a massive lack of education in our doctors. And when we ask our doctors, when we gathered statistics just from a general population standpoint, our doctors, okay, how many of you have had a patient come to you and ask you for advice or maybe some sort of guidance to use cannabis as a medication or, authorization to use cannabis instead of something else? How many of you guys have had that? Because we wanted to know, like, is this common? 92% of them have had a patient come and ask them. That's like almost
Wow.
100%. Okay, so then we looked at, well, what are the barriers to like proper care? Well, only 6% of them had ever had any kind of education on using cannabis or cannabinoid molecules. So the barrier is obvious. It's that they are not taught. So don't have confidence to provide any kind of guidance. But that creates a problem, right? Because the product is available there. So now, rather than using a medical professional to maybe help you guide them,
Yeah.
they're just going straight to the bud tenders. So because they don't need a doctor. So what you've done now is you've actually taken the patient out of the healthcare system rather than keeping them in the healthcare system, right? And it's a it's a pharmacologically active agent. Like, if anything, you should want
Yeah.
to have somebody there to guide you. But then you have to remember our doctors are very busy. We don't have enough doctors. They have like 3 minutes with every patient. So
Mm.
like they don't have a lot of time. And cannabinoid as a therapeutic, it takes an interaction with your patient. You have to spend time with them, and the patient has to be willing to toy with the levels that they're taking and the amounts, because everybody has a different optimal dose. And
Hmm.
so I personally think that we could have an entire undergrad degree just teaching people how, the endocannabinoid system and how to use it as a therapeutic. And I hope one day that we can do that, because the doctors, they're too busy. Like that, I think we're aiming at the wrong people there. And so in athletics, when I went and was interviewing medical staff there, they're busy, same thing. But now you have a different population, because
Yeah.
your job is to keep these athletes, which are $1 million athletes, safe. And so if your $1 million athletes are interested in this substance and they're able to access it, and you don't have any kind of rules against it, which the NFL still has rules at certain, just in preseason, I think. And then, but it's like if they can access it, then your responsibility as a healthcare provider is to be able to provide them with information and guidance about it. It's not okay to just be like, pretend, like look the other way and pretend we don't know what's happening, which is pretty much what's going on. Like, but everybody is scared of the hierarchy and of who sets the rules and who you answer to, including the athletes. They don't necessarily want to talk to somebody in their team about it because they're worried that they're going to get in trouble. And then the medical staff are worried that they're going to get in trouble if they were giving them sort of guidance on it. And so
Mm.
the NCAA removing it as a prohibited substance has created a space, in my opinion. Well, okay, then if you're going to remove it, then you have to teach them how to use it responsibly, the same way that you did with alcohol. The this whole punishment model, that's ridiculous. The abstinence thing doesn't work. All the athletes say that. It's offensive to the medical staff when they're learning this message, where it does not align with what we see in society. And so athletes, and a lot of them are actually gravitating towards cannabis for different reasons. They're choosing it over other things for different reasons. For example, alcohol. Alcohol, there's a next day effect in athletics that takes up time. They're dehydrated, they're hungover, they can't train, they lose a day when they spent Saturday night drinking 16 beer. If they spent Saturday night, they ate a gummy just totally recreationally. Well, the next day they probably sat at home, ate something, and went to bed. And then the next day they can train. They're not dehydrated. They're probably have their inflammation reduced, and they can carry on. And so the dysfunction now that we see is like the regulations aren't lining up with reality. And so it's to find a way to correctly and put in place the policies that align with these things. Because if you don't, you're fractioning the trust of your athletes towards their team, and you're fractioning, the trust that they have that you're able to actually care for them in all capacities. Because if you can't answer their questions about this one thing, they're just going to bolt and go find their information somewhere else. And you
Mm.
don't want that.
Right. No, and I would think in an athlete population too. These are people who are very hyper aware of their bodies and how they perform, and they're always trying to get an edge. That's why you have people jumping into cold plunges and
Yeah.
having different diets and things like that. I would think that, cannabinoids as a way to reduce your inflammation or maybe, reduce your anxiety so that you can perform better. Like I would imagine a lot of athletes are very interested in that and are experimenting with it.
Yes, and that's the thing, is they are experimenting with it. They are training with it, and they have found results. And so these guys, and they learn from each other. So if one, they're like ants. Like if one
Right.
guy has a good experience, they'll tell the next guy, before you know it, then they're all trying it. But they're not wrong. There are things, like it does legitimately have molecular mechanisms that do reduce inflammation. And so that can help you recover. We have to prove that out in humans, but
Mm.
in theory, so if they're feeling that, you can't tell them that what they're feeling is incorrect. If they're feeling, if it does reduce their inflammation and stuff. And so that's where the dysfunction is between research and the real world. And I think cannabis is one of the places where, I mean, I can't even think of another one where research is further from real world. I
Mm.
mean, the real world, they're doing stuff like, I mean, athletes, because I work with athletes, they'll try exactly like you said. I mean, they want an advantage and they want ways to, advantage their body, because their body is their most important tool.
Yeah.
It is their most valuable tool, is their body. And they're very intentional about what they put inside it. They're not messing around with things that they think are going to hurt them. So if they try something once and they're like, yeah, I didn't feel good, they're not going to do it again.
Mm.
But if they try something and they're like, okay, wow, whatever hurt before doesn't hurt anymore, or I was able to recover faster, but then they're at a loss for, they're going on Google or whatever to get their information. There's no place for them to find, they don't know how to find good information. And then the question is like, well, would they even ask their team anyways? And then if they did ask their team, what could the team even offer them
Mm.
as far as answers go? And currently, not much. Like and now the NCAA is in the exact same spot because they've removed it as a prohibited substance, which I applaud them for doing that, because it didn't make any sense to have it prohibited anymore. Because there are valid places where athletes should be able to use cannabinoids. And one place that comes to mind because it came up a lot with female athletes, and they use it for once a month. They are doubled over in pain with menstrual cramps, and
Hmm.
cannabinoids work amazingly for reducing, because menstrual pain is both neurological and it's nociceptive. So you have neurons firing and you have tissue inflaming, and cannabinoids can get at both of those to reduce them. And it does work really well in female athletes. And so you had female athletes that would prefer to use that instead of an NSAID or
Hmm.
any other type of drug. But if they did, they were at risk of losing their scholarship. And that was wrong, in my opinion. Like, they shouldn't have to worry about that and then have to take whatever prescription or other drug that you say is good when they would prefer to use something else. So the autonomy over their own choices, I think, is also making it, I think athletes are voicing that more now than they did before. So I definitely think, yeah, I think the athletes for sure are, they're trying different things as they always do. That's not new. A lot of times
Yeah,
athletes, like, we
right.
call it bro science, right? Like, bro science
Yep.
is always about 10 years ahead of actual science. And half the time they're right, and half the time they like harm themselves. But I mean, a lot of the times they come out with, like, these guys that just do it because they're like, okay, well, I'm just going to try it. And then, like, then science catches up, right? But bro science, there's something to that. Like, it's, so
Yeah, no, and it's funny you see it in cannabis cultivation too, where the growers, they're not trained scientists or whatever, but they know what works and they've been using it for a long time, and only now the researchers are coming along and understanding, like, okay, well, this is the mechanism and that's why that works.
exactly. And I think that cannabis, honestly, like, I laugh all the time because it's it's backward, it's been backwards since the beginning of time. Like, what other substance, like, Meshulam wanted to know why people were getting high. And so in 64, like, he isolated, like, the THC molecule, but it's like we went completely backwards as far as, like, usually in pharmaceuticals, you're looking for an agent to cause an effect. And in this place, we already had the effect and we were
Yeah.
trying to look for the agent. Like, it's backwards. And then we had no idea how it worked. And then we discovered this enormous endocannabinoid system because we discovered this molecule in a plant. Like, normally, what system you're working in and you're looking for, like, it's completely backwards. So we discovered, like, isolated the molecule and then happened to discover the biggest neurophysiological receptor system in your body because we were looking at what, like, it was completely backwards. And so I think, I laugh because it's like almost everything is backwards in cannabis. Like, yeah. But I mean, I think it's an opportunity really for people to learn so many things about so many things by studying it.
Yeah, so I mean, instead of going backwards, let's look forward. So, what new studies are you working on, or are you excited about that are in the works when it comes to cannabinoids and athletics?
So I'm really excited. We just finished the first part of our NFL clinical trial. So what we were looking at before we could go into the next part is we really wanted to see what is the optimal dose of CBD in an
Hmm.
athlete. Like, nobody knows, right? And you hear it all the time in people arguing over, like, low dose, high dose. Nobody really knows. And so we have a group of athletes that these poor guys gave so much blood every 2 weeks, but we had an escalating dose and we got them up to a pretty high amount. And so now we're going to calculate out what would appear to be the optimal dose just based on, the serum levels and stuff like that. So with that, then the next part is we're going to use that optimal dose and we're actually going to do a double blind crossover in a season of football. And we're using athletes in Canada in a football season, and we're going to use the product that we have. And this is where it's going to get really exciting because we're going to be able to compare the group that's using the cannabinoids compared to the group that isn't. And the metrics that we're looking at in that is, like, so exciting to me because we're looking at, a couple of things I mentioned before, the things that are happening in the brain, like the cerebral oxygenation and the cerebral blood flow. But we're also looking at the bioinflammatory markers to look at what the changes are in that when you're taking cannabinoids versus when you're not.
Hmm.
And then we're also going to look at, of course, the pain scores. We're going to look at the concussion scores. We're going to look at the contractility of their heart because we want to look at because your heart is electrical and the endocannabinoid system functions on ions essentially. So we're going to look at the heart and the differences in the contractility and blood pressure. Like
Mm.
we're looking at sleep scores, we're looking at their mental status. So like we're going to be able to pull so much data out of this specific to athletes, which hasn't been done. Like athletes just haven't really been studied because, they're a healthy population.
Right.
But for me, you know, they really are representative of a great number of people in the world, like weekend warriors or people that are
Hmm.
generally healthy, like people that are looking for, you could consider it a supplement, really like a supplement agent. And so that is really exciting to me. And the other thing that really excites me is the progress that's being made right now in biophysics, which is looking really at the ion exchanges between like all of your cells. So usually when you're looking at ion movements, it's brain waves, because we know that your neurons function on electricity and your heart functions on electricity. But with recent research, we've been able to see that the ion movements between all the cells. So there's a lot of communication. It's a communication system. And so it's a communication system that typically, we know your body runs on biochemistry. So that's looking at the chemistry of it.
Hmm.
But above that, it's actually physics, it's ion exchanges. And so when you look at, that's one of the things we're looking at in the brain, is the brain oscillations, also using the cannabinoids, because there's a lot of information there, I think. And I think that the future for that is really bright, I think. And I think that it'll develop a whole new way to treat bodies, sick bodies too, because right now we treat them with, medication or things that are targeting receptors. But if we could develop the ability to, like a quick example is cancer cells, like you can see a cell that's about to turn cancerous because there's a change basically in the bioelectric frequency of the cell. So you can see it by the change in the ions. If you could, in theory, use that information to then reverse it by using ions and electricity rather than chemistry, you could potentially find ways to actually push physiology again, just
Mm.
using a different mechanism. And so for me, I'm always looking at how do you push physiology without drugs, really, And so that really was the endocannabinoid system to me. Is I think there's a lot going on there. And it started with me looking at it because you can push that system without the cannabis plant. You can
Yeah.
invoke it with exercise, you can invoke it with meditation. The cold plunge that you just talked about before, when you shock it, you secrete endocannabinoids. And so
Right.
singing, you secrete them when you sing, you secrete them when you dance. And so it's like a lot of the things, again, that historically and traditionally and culturally were used for therapeutic reasons.
Mm.
And again, it was like bro science culture mode. Like they were doing it and they were doing dancing and chanting and nobody knew why it worked. But now we come to find out, oh, wow, they're secreting a massive amount of anandamide when they're doing that. Well, that makes perfect sense because anandamide is named that because it's the bliss molecule. So
Yeah.
it makes a lot of sense, right? So what they always knew to be true, now we have the technology to actually prove out molecularly why it is true. But they always knew that it was working, way back when. And so, yeah, so I think that for me, it's an exciting space to be in because you're looking at your neurons and you're looking at your like the
Mm.
immune system, which to me really, I mean, it touches everything in your body.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is exciting. Lots of work to do.
Yeah. Yep.
So wrapping up, Liz, I want to give you an opportunity to share any other resources or papers that you know of that you think the listeners might be interested in reading up on if they're curious about some of these things. And then also any website, social media, or ways that people can connect with you to learn more.
Yeah. So the paper that I recently published, the one that you mentioned, is in the Sports Medicine Journal. And then our protocol for what we're doing for our clinical trial was just published in BMC Neurology. And so that lists all of the different metrics that we're going to be looking at in our athletes. So if that's of interest to anybody, they can search that one up too. And then I don't really have a lot of social media. So I have, there's a website, a research website, basically that just kind of updates what we're doing, and it's trainwithmaryjane.com. And then on Instagram, it's just trainwith.maryjane. And there's not a ton on there, but there's, just updates, brief updates.
Excellent. Well, I'll put links to all of that stuff in the show description so people can have an easy way to find it. And Liz, thanks again for taking the time. This is fascinating stuff that you're working on. We're excited to see where it goes, and hopefully we'll see you down at CanMed real soon.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right.